PS Resolution Number 337, resolution asking the Honorable Supreme Court of the Philippines to rule on whether or not the concurrence of the Senate is necessary in the abrogation of a treaty previously concurred in by the Senate.
Mr. President, we are in the period of sponsorship. May we recognize the principal author, Senate President Vicente C. Soto III, to sponsor the measure, after which we'll also recognize the minority floor leader.
Senate President is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. My esteemed colleagues, thank you very much. Of course, thank you to the Chairman of the Committee on Rules and Majority Leader for calling this very important sense of the Senate, Mr. President. Mr. President, Section 21, Article 7 of the 1987 Constitution provides, and I quote, "No treaty or international agreement shall be valid and effective unless concurred in by at least two-thirds of all the members of the Senate." On the other hand, Section 25, Article 18 of the 1987 Constitution states, and I quote, "After the expiration in 1991 of the agreement between the Republic of the Philippines and the United States of America concerning military bases, foreign military bases, troops, or facilities shall not be allowed in the Philippines except under a treaty duly concurred in by the Senate and, when the Congress so requires, ratified by a majority of the votes cast by the people in a national referendum held for that purpose and recognized as a treaty by the other contracting state." End of quote. Mr. President, although it is clear from the provisions of the 1987 Constitution that the concurrence of at least two-thirds of all the members of the Senate is necessary for the validity of a treaty or international agreement, there is obviously a lacuna legis, or an absence of an explicit provision in the 1987 Constitution as to whether or not the concurrence of the Senate is necessary for the termination of any treaty earlier concurred in by the body. Now, it involves important constitutional question brought about by the executive's withdrawal from an agreement or a treaty like the BFA, as well as the earlier Rome Statute creating the International Criminal Court, which affect the core of the constitutional mechanism of checks and balance. The resolution before us now, Mr. President, does not question any of the two issues of the issue on the ICC or the BFA. The resolution simply seeks to find out if the power to ratify carries with it the power to concur in abrogation. Remember, there is no treaty if we do not ratify. Mr. President, the executive and the legislative branches of government have a shared competency on treaty making. So it is the submission of this representation and many others and many other members of the Senate that the concurrence of the Senate is necessary not only to accede to a treaty but also to its abrogation, a theory which is an adherence to the mirror principle. This question being raised by this representation involves an issue of transcendental importance that impacts on the country's constitutional checks and balances. It presents a constitutional issue that seriously affects the country's legal system as well as the country's relations within the international community. The Honorable Supreme Court ruled in Tañada versus Sagisag, the power to concur in a treaty or an international agreement is an institutional prerogative granted by the Constitution to the Senate. Thus, any member of the Senate has standing to question before his honorable court the impairment of this institutional prerogative. Now, Mr. President, as earlier manifested by Justice Secretary Minardo Guevara on the ABS-CBN franchise, that, quote, when there is a gap in the law, equity comes in to fill in the gap. End of quote. Now, since there is a gap in the law in this case, maybe the same principle can be adopted. There is also the emerging view, which has been known as the acte de contraire theory. Simply stated, it posits that when a constitution requires parliamentary or legislative approval for treaties subject to ratification, it likewise, by implication, requires the consent of Parliament or the legislature to withdraw from such treaties. Mr. President, I respectfully adhere to the rule that yes, the President of the Philippines is the sole representative of our country in foreign affairs, and I do not intend to go against the tide. I just want clarity. We want clarity. And I hope that once and for all, the Honorable Supreme Court shed light on this purely question of law. So, Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to adopt a resolution, this resolution, respectfully asking the Supreme Court to rule on whether or not the concurrence of the Senate is necessary in the abrogation of a treaty previously concurred in by the Senate. We ask that our colleagues be part of the Senate as it is, a Senate of the people. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. The minority leader is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, at the outset, let me extend my congratulations to the Senate President for initiating this proposed Senate Resolution 337. A similar resolution number 305, was filed earlier by this representation. It was referred to the Committee on Foreign Relations, where it is pending today. And in fact, there was one hearing where the issue was, as stated by the majority leader, by the Senate President, whether or not the Senate's concurrence is necessary in cases of withdrawal from a treaty. Mr. President, this resolution and the intended petition in the Supreme Court will settle the question of the definition of the constitutional boundaries insofar as foreign relations is concerned between this chamber and the President. The concurrence of the Senate in the withdrawal from treaties is an unsettled question, even in the United States. There is no case in the United States jurisdiction where the authority of the Senate to or the power of the Senate to concur in the withdrawal has been settled. The good sponsor, the Senate President, mentioned the mirror principle, and those who advocate that the Senate should participate in the withdrawal asserts that the process in the withdrawal should reflect and mirror the process in the concurrence. That is why it is called the mirror principle. As we said, in the United States, where our Constitution and practice, insofar as this is concerned, was copied, cannot help us in any, because there is no case decided there. But, Mr. President, I wish to invite the attention of the chamber to the Brexit, which is of common knowledge. Brexit, insofar as the withdrawal of Great Britain in the European Union had to have the authority of the Parliament, and the Parliament had to authorize the Prime Minister to withdraw. In South Africa, the Supreme Court of that country ruled that the concurrence of the Parliament is needed before the country can withdraw from the treaty. Mr. President, it is our respectful submission, and I join the Senate President in the effort to clarify and settle this issue once and for all. And this is brought about, admittedly, by the recent debate on the validity of the withdrawal from the visiting forces agreement, which the President, President Duterte exercised as a Senate as the President of the Republic without the concurrence of the Senate. In other words, the question is, can the President act alone in the withdrawal when the concurrence of the Senate is necessary to make the treaty effective? Mr. President, this is an important question. During the hearing on proposed Senate Resolution number 305, which the Committee on Foreign Relations conducted last week, the DFA was asked, is it the view of the DFA that the President can act alone in case of withdrawal? The position of the Department of Foreign Affairs is yes, the President can act alone. So this representation asks the question, can we withdraw from the ASEAN Treaty? Can we withdraw from the JPEPA? Can we withdraw from the tax treaties? Can we withdraw from the UNCLOS, which sets the 200-mile limit? That is, and can we when we withdraw from the Treaty on Exchange of Prisoners, etc., etc., etc. All of these treaties, Mr. President, involves very serious policy questions, which has very serious consequences. UNCLOS, the UN law of the sea, if we can withdraw from that, what happens to our 200 claim in the South China Sea? Now, tax treaties are concurred in by the Senate before it becomes effective. Are we saying that the President alone can withdraw from the tax treaty? What happens to the benefits that a taxpayer would have availed of by reason of the tax treaty? In other words, Mr. President, what we are pointing out is we are asking the Supreme Court to rule on these very serious policy issues if the rule is that the President alone can withdraw from the treaty. That is why, Mr. President, in about 20 treaties where this chamber concurred in the ratification, there is a clause which says that the withdrawal from that treaty requires the approval of the Senate. That is specified in each of these 20 resolutions concurring in the ratification. We must find out from the Supreme Court if this condition is valid, so that at the appropriate time we can act accordingly, consistent with our duties under the Constitution. These and other policy issues, Mr. President, requires a ruling from the Supreme Court. And let me once more congratulate the Senate President for taking this initiative of asking for authority from the Senate to go to the Supreme Court and ask these questions. With that, Mr. President, I urge the Chamber to approve proposed Senate Resolution 337. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Minority Leader. Senator Pacquiao wishes to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just have a comment. I will read this topic, Mr. President. We discussed this already in the past Congress, Mr. President, with Senator Drilon about this abrogation, Mr. President, and I quote this Article 7, Section 21. It says that no treaty or international agreement shall be valid and effective unless concurred in by at least 2/3 of all the members of the Senate. That's right. That's correct, Mr. President. But our Constitution, Mr. President, is not saying that to abrogate must have concurrence of the Senate. And the law is clear. There's a saying may kasabihan sa batas nga, expressio unius est exclusio alterius. So meaning is when it is not expressed, it is not there. So yun yung ibig sabihin, Mr. President, na kung wala namang sinasabi ang batas natin, giving solely power to the executive. That's my interpretation, Mr. President. But since we are the body, we will ask the opinion of the Supreme Court about this interpretation of the Constitution. We will respect the interpretation of the Supreme Court about this abrogation of international treaty agreement, Mr. President. That's all, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Risa is,
Mr. President, my apologies. Senator Gordon had the floor.
I'm sorry?
Senator Gordon had already made a previous request to speak as well. Senator Gordon.
The chair has recognized Senator Risa briefly. Senator Gordon is now recognized.
Good, good. I yield to the lady. I'm gathering my notes.
Yes. Senator Risa, please proceed.
Thank you to the gentleman from Zambales, to whom I was willing to waive my turn since he's one of the authors. But thank you. Mr. President, I would like to manifest my intent to co-sponsor Resolution 337 and 305. While I maintain my opposition to the Visiting Forces Agreement, an opposition historically held by my party, Akbayan, I cannot agree that the executive can unilaterally withdraw from treaties without Senate concurrence. Indeed, there is a lacuna in the law, but in the absence of any clarity in legislation, it is prudent to err on the side of greater checks between the branches of government. I join the Senate President and the Minority Leader. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Risa. Majority Leader, Senator Gordon is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was supposed to be absent today. I had not been feeling well, and I didn't want to spread the coronavirus here. But Senate President Soto called me on this very, very vital issue involving the future of our country, involving the security of our country, involving the territory of our country. And that's why I had to come here post haste, Mr. President. And thank you, Senator Soto, for telling me about it, because I wanted to sign the resolution not only as a co-author but as sponsor, together with our other eminent senators here, Senator Soto, Senator Drilon, Senator Lacson, and others, Mr. President, and now Senator Risa. Having said that, Mr. President, at issue here is really the issue of the constitutional provision that says that there must be concurrence on treaties. Unfortunately, according to some people, depending on which side they're on, they'd rather look at it as a very, very limited scope, Mr. President. There must be concurrence of treaties, Mr. President, and it requires 2/3. And it says the Senate must be the one who will concur or ratify the treaty, Mr. President. Talagang mahigpit yung provision ng Constitution. At siyempre, nung hinarap po yan dito sa Senado nung araw, ang luwas po dyan, pinag-usapan lahat yan. Makakasama ba yan sa interes nasyonal ng ating bansa? Makakasama ba yan sa seguridad ng ating bansa? Makakadagdag ba yan sa kakulangan ng ating armed forces? Lahat yan pinag-uusapan. At lalo na ngayon, kailangan kasama rin ang Senado sapagkat kung may power to say yes to the treaty, it should have the same power to make sure that we are consulted when they abrogate. Otherwise, we have one-man rule, Mr. President. We cannot have absolutism. Basta sinabi ng Presidente, yan ang patakaran ko. Nakalagay sa Constitution yan. Ilang provisions sa Constitution ang kailangan kukonsultahin ang Kongreso, Mr. President. On the matter of appointments ng Presidente, konsultado tayo lahat sa Commission on Appointments. On the matter of declaring war, Mr. President, kasama tayo lahat dyan. Hindi sila pwede mag-declare ng war. Kailangan kasama tayo dyan. At marami pang iba. Kung tayo ay mag-declare ng emergency, kasama ang Senado at ang lower house. Now, sa treaty, talagang isinantabi na pagka-treaty, supposedly, Mr. President, and I hope the House does not take umbrage, we are the senior house because we campaign far and wide in all four corners of the country, so we should have a little bit more of experience at dapat seasoned ka na. Hindi ka dapat makarating sa Senado kundi ka seasoned o alam mo lahat ang mga issues. So it's important, Mr. President, that in order to say na ito ay gagawin ng Pangulo, kailangan konsultado talaga ang Senado. Now, Mr. President, alam ko na ang treaty making power, siyempre, hindi naman makakapag-umpisa ang Senado ng treaty. Kailangan Presidente. That is understood by everyone. Hindi naman talaga uubra na tayo makikipag-treaty. Ang Presidente ang mag-i-engage, ang executive department ang mag-i-engage sa tratado. Kaya nga, siya ang chief architect. Ang architect, sasabihin niya, makikipag-treaty tayo dito, makikipag-international agreement tayo, pero dapat kasama ang Senado dyan sa bagay na yan. At pag nag-withdraw, certainly kasama rin ang Senado. Hindi naman po pwedeng, at kung tayo hindi nagkasundo, lahat ngayon ng hanay ng gobyerno, the executive, the legislative, and now the judiciary will now be involved, which means we are a working democracy where the President does something, we concur or object, and if there is a disagreement, we now go to take the whole full circle of the democratic principles that we have, that now the Supreme Court will be involved. That is why I support this proposal, and I think it's very present on our part, na dapat talagang sigundahan natin lahat yung position ng Senado. Besides, Mr. President, tayo ay co-equal branch. Hindi naman pwedeng lalampasan ng Senado na tau-tauhan na lang tayo sa Senado. Hindi naman pwede yan kasi dahil we're not a rubber stamp of anybody, Mr. President. We have to listen to the arguments and we have to make sure we have our say. Otherwise, lalampasan na lang tayo, wala tayong kakibo-kibo. Eh kung halimbawa, lalo na ngayon sa panahon na ito, ang daming issue dito sa West Philippine Sea or whatever way you want to call it. Palaging may bakbaka dyan. Palaging ang kasama natin na malaking neighbor, napaborado ngayong panahon na ito, sa lahat ng gulo kasama sila. Sa Paracels, kaaway nila yung Vietnamese. Doon sa Senkaku sa Japan, territory rin yun, kalaban nila. Sa atin, sa Spratlys, sa Scarborough Shoals, sa Ayungang Shoals, kalaban nila. Hindi ba dapat tanungin muna tayo kung makakabuti yan sa seguridad ng ating bansa bago tayo tumuloy? I say, Mr. President, that we must be consulted because here is where we debate the vital issues of the day. Here amongst us senators, dito natin pag-uusapan, katulad ng pag-uusap ni Senator Angara at Senator Subiri, pinag-uusapan nila ang vital issues of the day. Kaya lang, dalawa lang sila. Dapat masama sana sa debate rito, Mr. President. And so having said that, Mr. President, kailangan talaga kasama tayo dito na vocal lahat, marinig ano ang posisyon nito. Parang ABS-CBN yan eh. Ayaw ng local government, ayaw ng house na gampanan yung tungkulin nila. Ba't ganun? Nagpipilitan tayo. Malinaw sa Constitution, sa kanila yun. Bakit ayaw nilang malaman ako pro, ako against? Trabaho nila yan eh. Sagutin nila dapat yan. Ganun rin dito. Trabaho natin na pagka may agreement, pupuntahan tayo, at pagkatapos mag-ayaw na ng Presidente, wala na kayo, hindi na kayo kasali. No way, Mr. President. That is very dangerous. We're treading on tinatawag nating absolutism. Now, Mr. President, nabasa ko yung kaklase ko ng isang araw, si Tony Carpio, retired Justice ng Supreme Court. a fundamental principle is constitutional law is that laws are repealed or amended only by subsequent laws, either expressly or impliedly due to irreconcilable inconsistency between the prior and later law. This principle is so fundamental that it's not even written in the Constitution, Mr. President. Hindi ka pwede mag-amend. Now, ang tanong ko sa inyo is, di ba nakalagay sa Constitution, the Philippines adheres to generally accepted principles of international law, and it means that it's part of the law of the land. A law means a process, Mr. President. Exception ito na makakagawa tayong law, international law, pero kasama pa rin tayo pagka atanggalin yung proseso na yan. Now, Mr. President, nakalagay sa Article 7, the Civil Code of the Philippines, laws are repealed only by subsequent ones. Hindi pwedeng i-repeal na basta, ganoon na lang. Kailangan, it must be repealed expressly by subsequent ones, and their violation or non-observance shall not be excused by disuse or custom or practices to the contrary. Hindi po pwede yan. Para na naman yung franchise doon sa ABS-CBN. Sabihin lang, yan ang practice. Pinopromulgate natin, in-extend natin. That cannot be, Mr. President. Ganun rin dito. We cannot say, practice yan, amin na yan. No! Kaya nga nilagay yan sa Constitution para kasama po tayo dyan. Marami po akong gustong sabihin dito, pero itigil muna po ako at marami naman mas magaling sa atin dito, sa Senator Dillon, sa Senator Soto, Senator Pimentel. I just want to point out, Mr. President, that I stand foursquare with the Senate. We represent the people, and the Senate must be heard. We must find our voices here. And we have voices here, Mr. President. And those voices must be heard because we represent the nation. We represent the people in every nook and cranny that we are expected to speak para magigiyan. Pag nag-debate dito yan, lalong maintindihan ng taong bayan kung anong ibig sabihin itong nangyayari dito sa atin ngayon. And so, Mr. President, with that, I again thank and honor our Senate President and all our leaders here in the Senate for being alive and well, making sure that we are guiding our people in the directions that are important, that we are not going to compromise our national sovereignty, our national territory, and certainly we're not going to compromise the independence of the Senate. And that is important, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
Majority Leader, Senator Tolentino is recognized.
The President, just as a point of information, this representation would like to ask, but out of my utmost respect to the Senate President, I purposely did not ask some questions, but I would like to be answered by the Chair relative to Senate Resolution 337. Is this, Mr. President, a petition that is going to be filed if we approve Senate Resolution 337 in behalf of the Senate, with the Senate of the Philippines as the petitioner, or, Mr. President, is it going to be the proponents, the sponsors of Senate Resolution 337, which would appear in the Supreme Court case as the petitioners, Mr. President?
To respond to the query, the Senate President is recognized.
Yes. Mr. President, once the resolution is adopted, then if a petition is going to be filed, the Senate will be represented in that petition. Because once it's approved, it's a resolution of the Senate.
So,
And again, mind you, the issue in the petition that we are going to file is merely simply asking the Supreme Court to once and for all interpret the Constitution.
I am clearly informed, Mr. President, but it would appear, Mr. President, that this would really be a historical case because for the first time, we will now have three co-equal branches of government acting in unison to resolve an issue. The Senate petitioning acting as the petitioner, the executive branch acting as the respondent, and the Supreme Court ruling, if it will rule, if it will acquire jurisdiction, as to the merits of the case. Am I correct, Mr. President?
I'm sorry,
So sa kauna-unahang pagkakataon po, Mr. President, ay magkakaroon po ng isang kasong idudulog sa Korte Suprema kung saan ang tatlong branches ng tatlong sangay ng ating pamahalaan ay magkakaroon ng isang pagdinig kung saan magkakaroon ng isang kalutasan, kung magkakaroon ng jurisdiction ng kataas-taasang hukuman sa isang constitutional case. Tama po ba ako, Mr. President?
With the permission of the Senate President,
Please proceed, Minority Leader.
yes, Senator Tolentino is correct. We will have the Senate as an institution bringing the case for the Supreme Court. The respondent will be the executive branch who will be answering the petition, and the Supreme Court will be the one to arbitrate on the rights and obligations of the two branches. That is a classic situation where the two political branches may not be able to agree with each other, and it is this third branch, the Supreme Court, who will arbitrate on these rights. That's the role of the Supreme Court. And, Mr. President, this is not the first time this happens. There was a case involving EO 464, which yes, wherein also
cabinet members, police, military generals appearing.
yes. So this is not the first time. It has happened in the past. I cannot just recall what the others were, but there is nothing wrong with this. That EO 464, the Senate as an institution brought a case against the executive represented by the Executive Secretary Ermita, Mr. President.
but in this case, Mr. President, in fact, it's much simpler. We are not going against what the executive wants. We are merely asking the Supreme Court to decide once and for all.
Mr. President, although not familiar with the cases cited a while ago by the good minority leader, for the record, I agree that there has got to be a finality and closure to this issue. But let me manifest, Mr. President, that there are some provisions in our Constitution where there might appear to be a shared power at the onset between two branches of government, the legislature and the executive. The continuation of said power was lodged by the Constitution in just one branch of government. And I'm not referring to this instance, to the issue at hand, Mr. President, but to make a very clear example, though not totally related to an issue involving international relations, Mr. President, para maliwanagan po siguro, at ako po nagtataka rin kung bakit ang ating saligang batas o ang gumuhit ng ating saligang batas ay pinutol yung pagsasanib po ng kapangyarihan ng executive at legislative pagkatapos pong maibigay ng executive at legislative. And to cite one example, which we are doing every Wednesday for the last several weeks, Mr. President, pagka po merong i-appoint, Mr. President, na bagong kalihim ng isang kagawaran, kailangan po ang bukod sa appointment ng executive, ng concurrence, ng consent, ng Commission on Appointments, Mr. President. Halimbawa po noong nakaraang linggo, Mr. President, ay nanumbrahan
nanumbrahan po ang bagong hirang na kalihim Secretary Abisado bilang Secretary of the Department of Budget and Management. Yun po, yung paghirang po doon ay kapangyarihan ng executive. Subalit sa ating saligang batas, Article 7, Section 16 na ating saligang batas, kailangan po ang consent ng Commission on Appointments, ng Senado at ng Kongreso. Kung hindi po, hindi makakaupo si Secretary Abisado. Subalit, Mr. President, kung sakaling si Secretary Abisado ay hindi gumawa ng tama at siya po ay tatanggalin ng ating Pangulo, hindi na po kailangan ng consent ng Commission on Appointments kung siya ay tatanggalin dahil naghiwalay na po ang kapangyarihan ng ehekutibo at ng legislatura nang siya po ay ma-appoint. Nagbibigay po ako ng ganitong halimbawa, Mr. President, dahil para sa akin po walang pagkakaiba, halos pareho po pag nagkaroon po ng isang tratado at nangailangan po ng concurrence ng Senado, yung pag-abrogate po ay hindi naman nakalagay doon na kailangan ng concurrence pa ng Senado. Ganon din po yung halimbawa na binigay ko po kanina tungkol sa pagnunumbra ng mga kalihim ng iba't ibang kagawaran. Mr. President, what I'm saying is this. There might be a point of convergence during the initial stages of appointment, concurrence in treaties, but once these treaties are implemented, once the appointments are in effect, the member of the executive branch acting as a member of the cabinet, there is no more need for a legislative concurrence, or the word intrusion probably might not be the correct word, or interference, Mr. President. I agree that there has to be at some point in time, a constitutional decision as to the finality of this issue. Marami pa hong nakapending sa Committee on Foreign Affairs na iba't ibang tratado, marami pa hong mga treaties na palagay ko'y magiging controversial, not just with this administration, but future administration. For instance, the ASEAN market probably might be controversial in the future. The treaty concerning climate change might be controversial in the near future. The Trans-Pacific partnership might be controversial in the future. So, tama po, natapusin na ito ng Korte Suprema, subalit, sinasabi ko lang po na meron pong mga probisyon ng ating saligang batas at very basic po that implied provisions are never consented to by the Supreme Court in a long line of decisions. Siguro po para matapos na po ito, kung kailangan idulog sa Korte Suprema, idulog, but this representation maintains na dito po sa aspeto ng concurrence, again, with due respect to our very good Senate President na kailangan talagang ipakita ang kapangyarihan ng Senado, palagay ko po ay hindi nakalagay sa saligang batas. Kung ganun po ang mangyayari, let the Supreme Court rule, kagaya po ng sinabi ni Senator Pacquiao. So, with that, Mr. President, I end my point of information and manifestation as well. Maraming salamat.
Mr. President,
Just a very quick interjection with the permission of our
Senator
colleague.
Lacson is recognized.
And I'd like to address this to the gentleman from Cavite. The way I understand his position now is that he is in support of the resolution filed by the Senate President.
Mr. President, if I may clarify, I am in support of any move which would highlight and strengthen the constitutional prerogative of the Senate as an institution.
Which is exactly what is contained in the resolution. So,
but as I have explained, Mr. President, perhaps in this issue,
a simple yes or no will suffice, Mr. President. I just would like to find out because I'm a little bit confused because while your opinion clearly states that you have some reservations, but you are not the Supreme Court. And at the end of your discourse, you mentioned that at some point there should be a convergence, and it is up to the Supreme Court to interpret the provision on the matter. So, are you in support of the resolution filed by the Senate President or not?
I still remember clearly, Mr. President, the adage mentioned by Senator De La Rosa that you don't confuse the enemy. But Mr. President, seriously, Mr. President, I am in support of a resolution
Thank you very much, Mr.
clarifying
President.
the functions of the Senate. But, Mr. President, as regards the prerogative of the Chief Executive, I maintain that the Constitution is silent as to whether a Senate concurrence is needed. That's why, Mr. President, I mentioned during the initial stages of this discussion weeks ago that we respect the separation of powers. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, again, I quote the Secretary of Justice, equity fills in the gap. And now, Mr. President, I beg the indulgence of the gentleman from Cavite, but the mention of the CA confirmation, in that case, it's a very different situation, Mr. President. As a matter of fact, an executive who serves at the pleasure of the President may serve even without the CA confirmation. It has happened so many times. Secretary Gonzales of the Department of Justice was Secretary of Justice for 5 years without passing through the CA. You know, Dinko Suliman in the SWD. It's a different situation, Mr. President. Many other secretaries, Mr. President. So it's a different situation, Mr. President.
Senator Pimentel, then we will have Senator Pangilinan.
Thank you, Mr.
Please
President.
proceed.
With the permission of the sponsor, who is the Senate President, if I could propound some questions too, precisely to help us decide, because it's the intention to vote on this proposed Senate Resolution number 337 this afternoon, Mr. President.
Yes,
okay, so-
yes, Mr. President, yes.
So maybe we need some clarificatory matters, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, I have noticed in the discussion that some of our colleagues went into whether or not the Senate has the power to concur in the abrogation of treaties, which is precisely the issue in another proposed Senate Resolution 305, which is pending before the Committee on Foreign Relations, and for which I am now conducting a referendum to determine the sentiment of the committee as a collegial body. And just to give you a peek into the results, it's a close fight, Mr. President, as of the moment. I think the count is 5-all as of the moment. So my question is, how different is PS Resolution 337 from 305? Because in the discussions, our colleagues could not avoid discussing the power of the Senate. So I just want to make sure that is 337 neutral as far as 305 is concerned, Mr. Senate President, in the sense that we are not stating in any way in 337 that the Senate has the power to concur in the abrogation of treaties.
Well, the difference, Mr. President, is first of all, in this resolution 337, there is no mention of any specific issue. No mention of the Rome Statute, ICC. There is no mention of VFA. It's simply asking an interpretation by the Supreme Court on the thinking that the Senate must assert its power and ask that we be allowed to concur in any abrogation. Like in this case, Mr. President, the pending issue, whether it's the ICC or the BFA. As a matter of fact, the BFA could be a very good example. If the Supreme Court says, yes, you must be asked to concur, then we could probably sit down and talk about the agreement and probably make it better. Or at there is also a possibility that we will concur with the President and terminate. You know, anything can happen, but the important thing is that we must find out once and for all, because of the silence in the Constitution. And there are many, yes, implications. Indeed, as mentioned earlier, it's correct. But once and for all, Mr. President, let's settle this. And the resolution is as much as possible, as simple as possible. And then we were aware of the fact that Resolution 305, principally authored by Senator Frank Vilon, has been very controversial as far as the members of the committee are concerned. They could not, you could not come up with a final agreement on whether to approve or not. So we tried our best to make a simpler version. And again, also with Senator Vilon.
Senator Drilon.
Being the author of proposed Senate Resolution 305, Mr. President, there is one basic difference. Proposed Senate Resolution 305 was trying to get the sense of the Senate. It is a sense of the Senate resolution wherein the Senate will assert or is asserting that no withdrawal from a treaty can be effective without the concurrence of the Senate. That is the sense of the Senate that we seek to have approved in proposed Senate Resolution 305. The proposed Senate Resolution 337 is not of that nature. 337 simply is an authority from the Senate to authorize the Senate President and the other Senate to authorize the Senate to bring the case to the Supreme Court as an institution. That is the basic difference. And moreover, Mr. President, as we have mentioned earlier, there are 20 or so concurrent resolutions which contain this condition that in the withdrawal, the Senate must concur. So once and for all, we should have a ruling as to whether or not this condition is a valid condition or not. If the Supreme Court says you have no business securing the concurrence or insisting on your concurrence in withdrawal, then those 20 or so resolutions can be interpreted as not the provision in the resolutions of concurrence will be declared void. That's all, Mr. President.
Thank you for that clarification. You know the reason, Mr. President, why I asked that question? Is it so that those who are not in favor of 305, who are voting no against 305, can still vote in favor of 337 because these are entirely two different matters. Although in the discussion, we could see that there is some overlap because we cannot avoid discussing the substance of 305. So my next question, Mr. President, is how will this issue be presented to the Supreme Court? Will it be in a neutral way?
The minority leader wishes to
Yes,
answer
the minority
question,
leaders are recognized.
With the indulgence of the Senate President, we are preparing the petition initiated by the Senate President. My lawyers are studying it. It seeks the declaration of the rights between the Senate and the Executive. It presents a transcendental question, and there is a petition. I know that what the gentleman is leading to is their jurisdiction on the part of the Supreme Court. Yes, we will assert that there is jurisdiction.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. President.
Oh, by the way, the petition is almost done. We were just checking the grammar.
And for the record, just to be for our colleagues to be very clear about proposed Senate Resolution 305, which is not the measure we will vote on this afternoon. It does not mention specific treaties also, Mr. Senate President, 305. It's a general rule that withdrawal from treaties already concurred in by the Senate needs Senate concurrence to be valid and effective, the withdrawal. Yeah.
Mr. President,
just to be clear.
May I, given the fact that there is this resolution presented by the Senate President, the moment we pass this resolution, may I request the Committee on Foreign Relations not to act in the meantime in proposed Senate Resolution 305 because an action there one way or the other could be interpreted as a position of the Senate in the case that we will file. Just as an example, if the committee will say the Senate, we will not pass this resolution, we do not have the majority, is that an interpretation? It could be an interpretation that the view of the committee is that the concurrence of the Senate is not necessary. May we request that the matter be held in abeyance, because I noticed that there is already a referendum being routed around. May I request that for the sake of the Senate as an institution, we request the committee not to act on this Senate resolution. In the meantime,
I will,
yes,
I heard the request, Mr. Senate President. I will ask guidance from the majority leader what we can do under the rules of the Senate. We just follow the rules, okay? But no, majority leader, no need to respond as of the moment. So, Mr. President, for example, on page 2 of the pending measure, which is proposed Senate Resolution number 337, the third whereas clause, we are stating here that there is an urgency to determine this purely legal question, So, don't we need to say why? Because we're not mentioning any friction, any clash, any dispute at all, Mr. Senate President.
Yes, Mr. President, because it has been a long-standing issue already. As a matter of fact, we have, as mentioned by the minority leader, we have approved 20 resolutions saying that it should be, that we should be asked to concur in any abrogation. So, and then, of course, the pending issues that might need our concurrence is pending. Like, for example, the BFA has 180 days or 90 days, 180 days before determination. So do we concur with that or not?
So, yes, thank you for that, Mr. Senate President. So, in the petition which will be filed before the Supreme Court, what incident will we use as the justification to convince the Supreme Court of the rightness of the issue for judicial determination? No, because we are in the resolution, and since for example, let's assume that we will no longer amend the resolution by specifically stating what is the clash between the Senate and the executive, but it must be somehow mentioned in the petition. So for those of us interested in knowing this topic, what would be the incident, the dispute, or the clash between the Senate and the executive branch, which will be used as justification in the petition to be filed to convince the Supreme Court that the issue is ripe for judicial determination?
Well, we will definitely mention the fact that indeed it is due to the transcendental importance of the issue that need to be resolved. There were national interests involved, and one specific issue would be because of urgency. The DFA sent already a notice of withdrawal to the United States Embassy on the VFA, and are we supposed to concur or not? No need to concur or not. We simply want to find out from the Supreme Court so we can dispose of that issue once and for all. I'm sure the Supreme Court would be able to sense the urgency of this petition, and
The 305.
hopefully it will be resolved as soon as possible. Why we will never find out if we don't file a case. We will never find out if my interpretation, your interpretation of the other people's interpretation is correct.
Thank you for that, Mr. Senate President. So last question, sir. If this resolution passes, 337, then we have now expressed the sentiment of the Senate to file something before the Supreme Court so that they can now rule whether or not the concurrence of the Senate is necessary in the abrogation of a treaty previously concurred in by the Senate. So, am I correct in assuming that the Senate will be petitioner and then the counsel for the Senate would be the head of our legal department, Mr. President? Or we will hire outside counsel?
An outside counsel is possible.
Outside
Mr.
counsel.
Okay.
So, but under our rules, do we still need, do the members of the Senate still need to read or get to see the petition which will be filed on behalf of the Senate?
Yes, why not? Yes, Mr. President, we will furnish the members of the Senate because if the resolution is adopted, that becomes a resolution of the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.
Senator Pangilinan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, just 2 points. Mr. President, when if we pass this resolution, Senate Resolution 337, it will therefore authorize the Senate President to bring a case before the Supreme Court. Just to clarify, Mr. President, for the record, it is incorrect to say that this is the first time that such a case or the Senate would have brought a case before the Supreme Court involving the Executive Department. Mr. President, I was chairman of the Committee on Rules when the EO 464 petition, Mr. President, was brought before the Supreme Court. I was majority leader then. And I recall we even designated Senator Joker Arroyo as one of those who would represent and argue before the Supreme Court. Mr. President, EO 464 was the executive order of President Gloria Arroyo prohibiting or banning or preventing cabinet officials, military personnel from appearing before the Senate in its exercise of its legislative functions without the President's approval. And we felt this was an encroachment on the Senate as a legislative body in terms of being able to do its work. So that's not the first time, Mr. President. We've done this before. And I share the view of the Senate President, Mr. President, that the comparison with the Commission on Appointments would be, I believe, comparing apples and oranges. The CA is a separate body. It does not exercise legislative functions. It is a check on the Executive Department's power of appointment. So this is not the power to ratify treaties. This is not about the CA function. It's not about legislation. But in this case, Mr. President, it is the exercise of our power to ratify treaties and our exercise of legislative powers, Mr. President, that are at issue in terms of Senate Resolution 337. For the record, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Perhaps a final word before we ask the Majority Leader on his pleasure of the matter. The case, Mr. President, or the issue at hand is no doubt the constitutional question has to be raised once and for all because it has serious effects on the Philippines' international rights and obligations, and it will have an effect on the Philippine legal system. I think the body is ready to decide on the matter. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senate President. Senator Lacson, then Senator Tol.
Before that, have we resolved the issue raised by Senator Drilon? And this is addressed to the Rules Committee to, in the meantime, defer as far as the Foreign Relations Committee to defer action on PS Resolution 305. Because if it is not resolved yet, I'd like to ask for a parliamentary inquiry if we can vote separately on PS Resolution 305 and 337.
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Chairperson. Mr. President, we can vote on resolution number 337 today, only PS resolution number 337. It's the sole prerogative of the chairperson also to come up with a committee report eventually later on. But we don't need to calendar it, or we don't need to take action upon it and take action on this particular Senate resolution, in particular, Mr. President, PS resolution number 337 today. So we can vote on that resolution.
Mr. President.
I believe plenary action is the most important action in the Senate, Mr. President. With the action here today on the vote that we will take, could supersede the committee report, Mr. President.
Senator Angares recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just have an inquiry that can be answered by any of the authors or even the Senate Legal Department or the Majority Leader or any of the eminent gentlemen who have principally authored this measure. My question is, since it kind of takes off from the questioning of the chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, when he kind of alluded to the fact that if the Senate, because when I reading the text of the measure, it does not appear that the Senate is going to file the action, but it in the course of the interpellations of the chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, it appears that the Senate is going to file a case. What is the nature of this case, Mr. President? Is it an advisory opinion? Because we know, as all lawyers know, advisory opinions are frowned upon by courts. Or because then the Supreme Court may ask, what is the actual case or controversy at hand? So, are we bringing it as an adverse party, or are we bringing it as kind of a, I think this is a question that needs to be answered, and it's a case of first impression, thus, please, Supreme Court, rule on this. I'm just curious, what is the nature of our action, Mr. President?
At present, Mr. President, we are seeking for a declaratory relief and a mandamus. Indeed, a declaratory relief usually is presented to the RTC, but because of the urgency and because of the absolute necessity, we have decided to include it in this petition that we are going to file.
So the case, Mr. President, is declaratory relief that we are going to bring. Thank you, Mr. President.
And petition for mandamus.
Senator Tolentino, then Senator
And
Pangilinan.
mandamus.
Yes.
Well, when
Senator
you...
Angares still has the floor. Yes.
I think there's because pahabol yung mandamus, no? Declaratory relief is asking for an opinion, but mandamus is asking the court to rule or to order someone to do something. So there's kind of alternative actions, Mr. President, no? Because when you ask someone to do something, you're taking a position. Diba? This is our position, and you rule on it. And if you agree with our position, you order so-and-so to do this.
Mr. President,
Yeah.
because what the thinking right now is that if indeed the Supreme Court decides that yes, it has to pass through the Senate for concurrence, then the mandamus comes in, which is compel the executive through the executive secretary or the DFA to submit to the Senate determination of the agreement or petition, or the agreement or the treaty.
Thank you, Mr. President, for that clarification.
The chair is recognized for Senator Tolentino, then we will have Senator Dillon. Yes.
Mr. President, perhaps following the line of thinking of the gentleman from Baler, the case here would be entitled Senate of the Philippines versus President Rodrigo Roa Duterte. Am I correct?
No.
Because you will need to have a name respondent coming from the executive branch, or otherwise it might be Senate of the Philippines versus Executive Secretary Salvador Medialdea. But given our scheme of treaty-making powers. The executive secretary has never been involved in treaty-making powers. So it has got to be the President of the Republic of the Philippines. And again, I'm saying this is a case of first impression. It has not yet been done, with due respect to the previous cases filed before in past Congresses, wherein the President of the Philippines himself would become the respondent. Just a point of clarification, Mr. President.
Mr. President, with due respect, and I beg the indulgence of the gentleman, I've been discussing it with the resolution with the other members or the other authors. We would like to refrain from discussing the contents of the petition. What we're simply discussing is whether the Senate should ask the Supreme Court not. As a matter of fact, we might not even file the petition. We're still in that stage, Mr. President, so I hope we can just confine ourselves to the resolution.
Senator Pangilinan.
Yes, just a matter of procedure. Earlier, Senator Lacson inquired about Senate Resolution 305, which is pending before the Committee on Foreign Relations, and its relation to Senate Resolution 337. Mr. President, again, legislative precedents will guide us, Mr. President. The Senate can do two things. We can approve Senate Resolution 337, taking into consideration Senate Resolution 305, that is one option, or we can just approve Senate Resolution 337 separately. Just for the record, Mr. President.
No, that's okay. Move on.
Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. With all the discussions taking place today, illuminating the positions of our different colleagues, with that, Mr. President, we move to close the period of interpellation
Is there any objection?
and sponsorship. No, we're going to act on it now. Oh, sorry.
Senator
May I
Marcos
recognize Senator Marcos?
is recognized.
Yes. Are we approving? What exactly is the status of the call?
There will be a motion, Mr. President. There will be a motion to adopt the measure, and our colleagues are free to stand to object, abstain, or to vote in favor, Mr. President. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. President, with all due respect to our Senate President earlier, even if it's a gross oversimplification, regardless of whether the suit will be for declaratory relief, for mandamus or certiorari, whatever format it takes, the title would appear to be Senate versus PRRD. Is that correct?
To respond, the Minority Leader, one of the others is recognized.
The title will be, it will not be against President. It will be against the Executive Secretary because there is a mandamus portion, which if the Supreme Court sustains the right of the Senate to concur, the Executive Secretary will be required to refer the termination to the Senate for concurrence. So it is not against the President.
Yes, we understand that it would be the Executive Secretary as is habit, but being the alter ego of the President, it effectively also drags the President into the case?
Well, the President has to be impleaded as a formal party. We cannot implead any other person because it is the President who initiated the termination. And in all cases, as it presently stands, the President can terminate treaties without the concurrence of the Senate, as he has done in the Rome Statute, as he has done in the BFA.
But then again, Mr. President, we're not even there yet.
Yes.
We're still in the resolution of asking whether we should be asked to concur or not. Simply that, Mr. President.
May I add, Mr. President, with your permission of the body, this question has been pending since the 14th Congress, the 15th Congress, on the powers to abrogate, and approval of the treaties is very clear, but on the abrogation is not. And this is not an attack to the President, Mr. President. This is just to clarify our position of the Senate in the abrogation of treaties, Mr. President. There may come a time, there will be another new administration, then the President decides to, at that time, will decide to get rid of JPEPA, the Japan-Philippines Economic Partnership Agreement, because he's angry with Japan and the future President. I think that will be a difficult proposition to stomach at that time, Mr. President. So we just seek clarity on what they may or may not do, particularly on this issue, Mr. President. That is my position on the matter, Mr. President, as your majority floor leader. Mr. President, with that, I move to adopt Senate Resolution number 337, Mr. President, and will allow and recognize our colleagues who want to vote on the matter. Of course, subject to style, Mr. President. I move to approve and adopt.
Is there any objection?
They're calling for a vote.
If there is an objection, we will vote on the measure.
Yes, Mr. President.
Majority Leader,
Yes, Mr. President. If there's an objection, to be clear,
there is an objection.
to have some clarity on the vote, because I know some would like to vote in the abstention.
Okay.
We could do a nominal voting.
Those who are in favor of Senate Resolution number
Raise
337,
hands na lang. Raise your
please
hand.
raise your right hand. Those against, please raise your right hand.
Just to clarify, abstention. Senator Coco, Mr. President, would like to...
Yeah, before that,
Yes.
They will announce the results
Yes.
first.
The Secretariat, do we have the results of the voting? The results of the voting are as follows: 11 affirmative votes, 0 negative votes, 8 abstentions. The resolution is adopted. Majority Leader. Majority Leader.
Mr. President,
Mr. President, may we recognize our colleagues who want to explain the vote.
Senator Pimentel is recognized.
just a point of inquiry, because we have two colleagues who arrived after the vote or just immediate, or Senator Manny Pacquiao before even who arrived before the result was announced. So, what are the rules, Mr. President? Do we allow our two colleagues, Senators Cayetano and Pacquiao, to vote?
Mr. President, if we do that, we might as well move the voting for tomorrow and call all our colleagues to attend, Mr. President, if we do that. But we can't, the voting has been done, Mr. President.
The voting has been done unless
We can always
anyone who voted in the affirmative will now
That was-
request for a reconsideration of vote.
That was only a point of inquiry, so at least the basis.
Yes.
So, Mr. President, explanation, we are now in the explanation of vote. I abstained from the measure, Mr. Senate President, because although the proposed Senate resolution is harmless in the sense that it is not controversial, it's very important to know the how. The how, because this resolution expresses our sentiment to ask the Supreme Court to rule on whether or not the concurrence of the Senate is necessary in the abrogation of a treaty previously concurred in by the Senate. So, as far as this representation is concerned, I needed to know some more details on the how. That's why, without these details, I was forced to abstain from voting, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, maybe before we recognize our other colleagues for their explanation of vote, I believe the vote was 12 in favor because I count 12. Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. President. May we ask?
The Secretariat is requested to check the voting.
I think they did not count the presiding officer, Mr.
I
President.
voted in favor, Mr. President.
Then it's 12.
Yes, thank you. Just for clarification, Mr. President, may we get the official vote once again, just for clarity. I did just declare what the real score is.
Session is suspended for a minute.
You're 21 on the floor now, without wait.
After it. 12-7.
How was my vote counted?
It's already final.
Had I been here, I would have voted in favor.
So final. Session is resumed. Majority Leader, the
Yes,
Secretariat.
Mr. President, maybe be clarified with the actual vote, Mr.
Yeah, the actual vote is that there were 12 senators who voted in favor of the resolution and 7 who abstained. There are no votes, no negative votes, and the resolution is still adopted.